So thanks everybody for joining. Purpose of today is to talk about a variety of approaches to implementing row-level security. And we're going to run through those both through PowerPoint slides, but also a couple of workbooks. We'll take a look at examples. And disclaimer here, the content in here is pretty much drawn from a series of blog articles that Matt Miller, who was I think he was an associate sales consultant before he left, but he did leave. He was part of the OEM team. They're on Brian Howell's blog, Tableau and Behold. If they're great to send a customer. And I will share a link to this deck and the two workbooks. So if you ever get into a demo situation, you can kind of pull them out and talk to it quickly. So in many respects, that's really what the purpose of this is, just to share some content and provide a little bit of explanation behind it so that you can turn around and use it with your customers. Okie doke. Let's just take a jump into the agenda. It's a little bit wordy, but the thing we're going to do is touch on a variety of different scenarios and how to put them together. And we'll then kind of wrap up with a couple of slightly more esoteric approaches or arcane approaches to implementing row-level security, which in some cases can be appropriate. Okie doke. And as always, jump in with comments, rude comments, slams against the Philadelphia Eagles. All of that's welcome throughout the time we're together. Okie doke. So you kind of want to touch on the commonalities, or what essentially all of these recipes, except for the the last two approaches we look at, have in common. And essentially, the big thing here is we're, in all of these cases, except for the last couple, going to build some kind of a calculated field that implements the row-level security logic. Okay, so that's kind of step one. The next step is we want to use it as a data source filter. So we're going to go to the actual data source itself, and we're going to add a data source filter. And of course, what that means is that filter kicks in before any data ever passes to the viz to be further processed by, worksheet local filters and the like. So if it's a data source filter, then it's going to kick in and the user can't override it as long as, and we get to the next point, the data source is published, so they don't have a local copy of it, and the permissions are set such that they can obviously connect to and view the data behind that data source, but they cannot download it, they cannot change its permissions, etc. That's basically it. And we're just going to look at variations of those themes there. We do want to point out that as we look across these, we're going to be looking at solutions that apply to live connections, that apply to extracts, and why we have to take, or have special considerations for extracts. User level and group level, so we're going to look at working with the username and his member of functions. And then something that very frequently comes up is, my solution isn't simple, it's, kind of hierarchical. How do we manage that? So let's start with the simplest of these, and that's going to be, one-to-one row-level security. So what are we basically talking about when we describe one-to-one row-level security? Typically, that's where you have a data source where there's obviously a table or multiple tables that contain the data of interest, and then you have a table that contains the entitlements, and you effectively join them. And in the entitlements table, you're taking the domain that you're interested in and its discrete values, and you're associating them with usernames who are have the permission to view those particular domains. And you're then taking the username filter and or username value and the username from the entitlements table, and you're doing a simple equals in your calculated field. You apply it as a data source filter, publish it, apply appropriate permissions, etc. So let's dig into that a little bit from practical point of view. I'm going to row-level security. let's take a quick look at how it's defined. So all we're doing here is we're taking, obviously, the Tableau username function. We're making sure it is equal to the username that has been pulled into this data source from the entitlements table. And again, once that's published, we should be fine in terms of making sure the row-level security is in place and no one can, through any means, circumvent it or work around it. And we can see it in action here. Here we've got, the typical, how do you test logging in as a different user. So we'll log in as the, kind of the Joe Foreman, the manufacturing foreman. Joe should also be able to see all 5 sites. And this only happens when you're doing demos, in particular internal demos with everybody you know. This machine is literally almost not responding. And this morning, it's really slow here. Sorry. So we just kind of scroll over here a little bit, east, west, south, et cetera, et cetera. So we close that down. Then we take a look at manufacturing entitlements. And we look at the first 100 rows. And all our entitlements table has here are the values for the sites and usernames from the Tableau server, or in this case from the portal. So now when we go down here, hopefully this will be a little faster this time. It's literally not processing the click. Okay, there we go. So let's, this is Joe, so we really wouldn't expect to see a change here because Joe's a foreman. So we still see all 5. Let's log in as Rosie the Riveter, or simulate logging in as Rosie the Riveter. And we see 3 of the sites. So the role of the security is clearly kicking in. And it's all predicated on nothing other than this, calculated field that, just to look at the last piece here, which we've already discussed and everyone on this call is very, very familiar with, but the last ingredient here is that we're using this role of security calculation as a filter. We only want the values where it's true. It's a data source filter. And then, when we turn around and publish it, to say it for the umpteenth time, we make sure that nobody can change that data source or do anything to it other than just kind of get the data from it. So that's the basic recipe, and everything else except for the last 2 really represents a variation on a theme. Okie doke. So let's look at some of those variations. And by the way, if you do use this, for, customer-facing conversations, there's a kind of handy slide here. What I'll do is I'll create another kind of database in Postgres or some central server, and I'll send out, obviously, both of the workbooks so that you have access to them and can, if you want to, can walk through the demo and show everyone the actual specific pieces the way we did here over the past couple of minutes. Alrighty. So what if we want to, by the way, let me pause. Any questions or any, nope. Anybody, everybody still there? Might feel like I'm just kind of.
We're still here.
Alrighty, thanks. I feel like I'm just kind of rambling on.
No, you're doing a good job. It's appreciated.
So far, it's good. It's a good refresher, good reminder. So far, so good.
Alrighty. So one group to one row. So in this case, we're not necessarily including group names in the data. And this is going to result in a series of if, then, else statements. And again, everything else will apply as far as, the commonalities, publish a workbook, put the appropriate permissions in place. Now, for this, I didn't create an example. This is just kind of a talk through. And since, of course, there are multiple groups that a user can be a part of, there's just not a function that returns a group name. So we kind of have to turn around and test for constants, literal group names in our calculations. And the big difference here then, when we're working with groups instead of users, is that we can't just do a simple equals. The user can be a member of multiple groups. So what we're saying here is we have to turn around, test for literal strings, and then where there's a match with that literal string, we're furthermore going to test for the domain values. So California, Illinois, etc. It's still a relatively simple scenario, and we could script all of this. And that does become a best practice, as you start to get to any kind of scale with this. If you've got a couple of data sources where this needs to be implemented and you don't have a huge number of users and or a huge number of unique domain values, it might make sense. It might be manageable to do most of this just manually. Just create the calculated fields and do the things that we talked about in the initial scenario. But as it gets more complex, it probably makes sense to, even if you can't use the tables directly, to have the rules stored in a data table or in an Excel spreadsheet, and then script out at least the text that goes into the calculations. And that might be a future thing to add in the way of making a little bit more of a demo out of this. And I'm sort of kicking Bryant Howe of Tableau and Behold fame. We're sort of talking a little bit about what might make sense in terms of the next thing that would really help customers. And maybe a little bit more of an expanded demo around row-level security might help, maybe some sample scripts. And I'd be curious what everybody thinks about that. What would, since this does come up, for us all, over and over, what would be the, besides, a couple sample workbooks and a PowerPoint, what could we hand a customer that would make this all kind of easier for them? Okay, so let's just look at the next scenario, a little bit more complex, where we have multiple fields to one row. And this, in many ways, is the same as a hierarchical kind of example. And I consider this to cover that case because, it could be multiple levels of the organization. Managers, assistant managers, employees, etc. Or we just might be crossing domains where, here we have state and we have category, and we're testing for them both. So it's a little bit more complicated and only drives home more the value of being able to script this because of the added complexity. I would say as a best, just for my money, I prefer to maintain these as separate calculations. Of course, these could be combined into one, but then that one calculation just gets a little bit more gnarly and involved. And of course, it may not, our use case may not be limited to just the two domains that we're, against which we're testing. We could have multiple. So unless there are or conditions involved, as long as they're all and conditions, personally, I think it makes sense to maintain, unique calculations. And then just another variation, which is sometimes we want to have the row-level security kick in according to our fine-grained rules here, but we also want there to be a group or a couple of groups that just have universal access. So it's again, just another variation on the general theme that we've been developing here. And in this case, we're going to go back to having a security table. We're still going to use multiple if-then-else statements. And what that looks like is what we're seeing here. And now you'll see that there is a slightly more involved scenario where we have a number of individuals who are part of the executives, and then from there we have granular permission for pretty much everybody else. I mean, it's not super complicated. Because this is a limited number of people, we could, if we were testing the data and we have it joined, we could test on role. And in that case, there would be the 3 roles in, a series of if, role equals X, Y, or Z, then 1. And then we can shift to else if, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sure that this is starting to get a little bit repetitive, and at exactly that point we're going to switch gears and look at working with extracts and kind of some of the considerations we need to have when working with extracts versus live connections. Just to pause again, any thoughts, questions?
Gordon, when you deliver this, what types of questions do you often get from customers, or is it, and what type of audience do you generally?
But no, needless to say, if the entitlements table is by definition it's going to be relatively small. But and then this is typical, if the data table is very large, then you could run into some performance issues and might need to actually add an index or something to support the join if there are, if you start to experience serious performance implications. But you won't know until you actually test, because it'll vary by the database technology and the amount of data and the exact query and the other things that are in the where clause, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. That's a consideration. What's it all going to look like when we turn it on and go live? And probably the conversation most of us have with our customers when it comes to that kind of thing is, to really get down to the lowest level, we can capture the SQL out of the logs and do a show plan or whatnot, and understand how the query is being resolved, and if it's possible, take remedial steps, maybe add an index or do something else, or add a table hint, an optimizer hint, which is only available in custom SQL, or if you need to do that, then create a view based on it and put the optimizer hint in the view rather than use custom SQL in Tableau, or stuff like that. And then it just gets that conversation about database, good old database performance. But it is a consideration, and thanks for mentioning that. Absolutely. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or add on that? Because that's a good topic.
Gordon, if I may on that. No. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
They will frequently not have access to the database or any ability to change it or implement things that would let them put that there. And frankly, this does work. It is a viable solution as long as within the environment where it's being used, it's also manageable. So there's definitely discussion to be had with any customer who's looking at this, and there are pros and cons to going both ways. And so, glad you mentioned that, Jeremy. Good stuff. So let's say the point of transitioning to this slide is everything we've looked at so far applies to live connections. Now we want to shift gears and say, what happens when we need to use extracts? And the challenge with extracts, of course, is if we do a join with an entitlements table and we have a really big data table, we may explode that thing so big that the extract is impractical, either because it just takes so darn long to create, or because the row count has exceeded that, kind of gray area of what we consider to be the largest workable extract, which, I don't know, when I talk to customers, they say it's around 1 billion rows is about as big as you want to get in an extract. And that's going to take some time to create. Well, it turns out that if you, and this is going to involve some work, some data prep, if you create a string, a string field, and I have a little example for that as well, that contains a comma-separated list of the values, then it, much to my surprise and probably everyone's surprise, the processing of that calculation is incredibly fast. You wouldn't think that you could have a bunch of really long string fields across, maybe a few 100 million rows, and then ask the data engine to search that string for a username and do it across all the rows and still be fast. You wouldn't think that that would work, but it actually does. And my best guess is that's because of among other things, we do dictionary compression. So all of those long usernames become really, really tiny tokens. So the actual string is really short, and there's probably only one instance. And then some pointers. I don't know that that level of detail, but that's my best guess as to why this winds up being really fast. So if your customer says for whatever reason, back to Darren's point, wow, and as Jeremy was echoing, we implemented these calculations like you said, and now this thing is really slow. The alternative would be to create an extract. Going to be some data prep work, but where you have fields that contain a comma-separated list of the domain values, and then you just do a contains or a search. And best practice here would be to make sure you include a comma or some other delimiter in your search so that you don't pick up substrings when you do the search. But this is what the row-level security filter comes to look like at that point. And then let's look at the actual user entitlement field, which I managed to misspell. So let's, I'm sorry, we want to go here. And there we go. And I'm sorry, you'll notice the other best practice is, make sure it's not, case sensitive. So those are all uppercase, and then I think we had the username wrapped in the upper function. So a couple of things there. This is an alternative to live connections. It actually turns out to be very fast. A couple best practices: include the delimiter in your search so you don't pick up substrings, and also remove case sensitivity. And you actually wind up with a solution for row-level security that's very viable with extracts. Again, assuming that we're going to build the row-level security at the Tableau layer. And in the real world, we wind up doing that a lot, even though it might not be absolutely ideal. Any other thoughts, questions around that?
Hey, Gordon.
Yeah.
Hey, Gordon. So is this intended behavior or is this by accident? Because, when we talk about best practices, right, we need to recommend intended behavior and, and not recommend something just because it works. You know what I mean?
Okay, good. That's fair. I don't know that we're recommending it only because it works. I realize I'm kind of trying to straddle this in that this does work. A lot of our customers use it successfully. I think the way, rather than say that it's not a best practice, in a way, maybe a way we position this is that here's the approach, and here are the caveats, and here's the best of all worlds. If you were in a position to do A, B, and C, and so we say here's the solutions. They work. Lots of our customers use them. Here are the caveats, which have to do with potential impact on database performance, manageability, scale, and anyone's going to see those issues if they start to work with this. But and there is a point at which those caveats, the impact of those caveats, becomes so large that this no longer is viable. Not that it was ever bad; it's just that at some point it's just not realistic, and then they're going to have to dig deeper. And and digging deeper means finding a way to implement this typically at the database layer. And that's kind of how I would prefer to kind of approach this. There's nothing here that gets labeled good or bad. I think it just gets labeled good for customer A, not for customer B. Customer B needs to think about doing something else. And we'll touch on a couple of those options at the end. Are you on board with that, or does that still strike you as inappropriate, or?
No, it's good. I was just asking the question because this is a huge subject for me, and a huge story for a lot of the customers, and I'm looking for solutions. So thanks for giving me.
Yeah.
David, I think any of these solutions are kind of compromise solutions, because the real solution is to implement this at the database level. But if you're not going to do that, then everything you're doing, you're going to trade off for that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. No, I understand.
It's definitely a nuanced conversation. Yep. And it's kind of like budget. The car one is the Tesla, the top of the line Tesla. But my budget says I got to go shopping this over here instead. Right now. That's just kind of so we got a car for everybody.
So I have one last thing. I don't want you to jump around, but I know you got a schedule. But I guess my last question is, how will Hyper change any of this stuff, right? So
quite a bit. And that's one of the last slides, is kind of looking forward to Hyper.
Okay.
And how we'll change it largely is the fact that if not in V1, and I believe the push right now, or the expectations we'll actually get in V1, but I wouldn't bank on it, would be multi-table extracts or normalized extracts. So now you throw the join at Hyper, you throw the entitlements table in the data, you've offloaded your source. You didn't explode it because it's still a live connection. It's a real-time join. It's not a multi-billion row extract, and presumably Hyper will execute the join and so forth as quickly or more quickly than any high-performance database. So Hyper makes things wonderful in a lot of scenarios. So we'll kind of and again, the caveat there is the expectations it'll be available in V1, but possibly not. And if not, it's a high priority item, and we'd expect it in the next dot release would be the the normalized extracts. Then it starts to get really interesting. This is
Hey, Gordon, you said something kind of important there. That's well, I said a lot of things important there, but what comments are call it out is right now. In some cases, when we do joins, we don't actually move the tables. We actually create a join in an extract, and we actually reference that behind the scenes like a shadow extract. I think what you're saying is that we're going to do something similar in Hyper, and that
taking the username and display, we're taking the display name portion of the username information, and we're populating it with, we're getting sneaky, we're populating it with a bunch of codes and values that we can then turn around and again use in a calculated field. Now, if we have to stretch like this is probably the least pretty, needless to say, of all the things that we've looked at so far. And one little caveat there is it used to be really great for pretty much all use cases until we got, and I'm pretty sure it was Tableau 10.2, where in web editing, we now show the full name in the screen. So if you expose web editing, this solution isn't viable as of 10.2 because instead of username, they're going to see all this wacky stuff that we stuffed into the display name field. And you get into all sorts of fun calculations that operate on strings, and if those functions are getting pushed down to a live database, boy, it's not going to be fast, typically. You said the fact that extracts process those string lookups quickly, should strike us as unusual or kind of an aberration, because typically when you do complex string calculations, you're inviting performance issues. So this is if you have to stretch and stretch and stretch to do something really crazy in Tableau, okay. But this would be, back to David's point, if there's a scale here, this is the bottom of the barrel. Hopefully we never have to go here in terms of implementing row-level security. It's the last thing we'd recommend, and here, even if it works, we'd probably want to say, this is unsupported, no warranty. Mr. Customer, you're buying that one as is and supporting it on your own, because that's a real stretch as far as row-level security goes. So lastly, just want to touch on, well, what if we agree that we want to do this in the best possible way and implement it at the data layer? How do we then tie Tableau to the fact that we've got row-level security implemented back at the database? Well, sorry, I just created these slides. Obviously this is parameterized. there are a couple possible approaches here. One is we create custom SQL. Oops, that's a con, because we don't want customers creating custom SQL if they don't have to, but maybe in this case they do. And effectively, we create a custom SQL statement, and we have it includes a where clause, and we pull that, username equals blah, and we pop in the parameter that is, of course, the Tableau username. So that's an option. It's not ideal, but everything we've talked about has been some combination of pros and cons. And here the con is the custom SQL, and also we don't have the ability to test for group membership because we can't pass, say, a comma-separated list of groups that the user is a member of down to the database. There's no way to capture that dynamically in Tableau, so we sort of lose that level. It's strictly user-based, et cetera, unless, we happen to actually, and that gets back to including part of this in the Tableau side versus the database. We, created some field in the data source with a, and customized it and did all that data prep, but we're back to implementing stuff with the Tableau layer versus the database, and I think you're losing kind of the benefit. So it's user only, it's custom SQL, darn it, not ideal. Another option would be initial SQL, where we set some session level variable, or pass some value we can get creative here as well. But again, not all data sources support initial SQL. What do you have to do on the database side in terms of programming? Because if we've got some variable floating around, now we're getting into the programming language of that database versus this solution, which could just work against a view that almost anybody can create in a database. This, we're talking about, calling on higher level skills at the database, and I don't jump up and down with excitement about either of these two solutions, but if they want to implement it at the database layer, to the extent I've thought about it, these strike me as the two approaches we could possibly use. And maybe we open the floor up there again, or people want to jump in with some additional thoughts about that, because really, really good, topic. Yeah, and I put this down as a fact here. I really do need to double check and see, is that what's happening when the extract is all pulled from, the hyper extract is all pulled from a single source? Do we pull the tables over that are part of the joins that we defined in the, when we created the data source? Or are we creating a single monolithic table still in hyper or something like that? I think we definitely want to get clarification around that. But the impact will be positive. I think that's pretty safe to say. And then, you can share with customers, here are a bunch of, cool URLs and whatnot, and see that basically these are the content that we've been sharing and, talking about for the past N minutes. So that's it. That's what I got. Boy, really, really good questions, good conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot, and it stimulated some thought, and made me kind of consider a few more things. Just opening it back up. What else do we want to cover here? Additional, feedback, thoughts, interest.